Hey there. Tonight we're stepping into the world of feudal Japan, a place governed by strict codes and careful routines, where a class of warriors shaped daily life. This is the story of the samurai, their duties, their training, and the quiet rules that guided them. Trained from youth and bound to service, they moved between the battlefield and the household. They practiced swordcraft and archery, studied strategy, and kept ceremonies. Meanwhile, they also learned poetry and meditation, in this way balancing skill with restraint. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is right now. Dim the lights, let the calm settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin with the life of a samurai. Long before the word samurai had settled into common speech, Japan was a patchwork of clans, local leaders, and shifting alliances. Small groups of people gathered around powerful families. They worked fields and tended livestock, and they also protected the lands and the homes of their chiefs. Over time, some of these households developed more organized, permanent armed forces. These early warriors were not yet samurai in the way later generations would understand them. They were, instead, clans with fighting men who defended territory, escorted important persons, and competed with neighboring groups for resources and influence. In the centuries that followed, the island that we now call Japan experienced significant social and political change. New technologies arrived. Rice cultivation expanded and became more intensive. Land produced surplus, and with surplus came wealth and the need to guard it. Meanwhile, contact with the Asian mainland brought ideas and models of governance. In this way, systems of rank and official institutions emerged. Court life in the central cities grew more elaborate. Yet the countryside retained a simpler, often harder reality. Local leaders in the provinces collected taxes, supervised irrigation, and maintained order in their own ways. They relied on armed retainers more and more. Over time, these retainers formed bonds of loyalty with their lords. Those bonds were based in personal obligation and mutual dependence. The early warrior clans gradually took on a more defined social and military role. At the imperial court, an official military force existed, but it was shaped by different needs. Emperors and their ministers kept guards at the palace. These guards were intended to protect the court and to project authority. They performed ceremonial duties as well. Meanwhile, provincial forces did not answer directly to the central government in many practical matters. As the court focused on culture and governance, local strongmen increased their control over land and people. In this way, the balance of power shifted. Some families who had originally served as imperial attendants or guards found new opportunities in the provinces. Their skills with horse and bow, and later with sword and armor, became assets in a changing landscape. They were hired as escorts, employed as enforcers, and entrusted with the protection of private estates. By the middle of the first millennium of the Common Era, a clearer distinction had begun to emerge between civil administrators and military families. The civil officials worked in the capital and handled law, taxation, and ritual. The military families, meanwhile, concentrated on the practical business of holding land and maintaining armed followers. In the broader social structure, powerful households accumulated private estates known as shun. These estates often enjoyed exemptions from provincial control and from direct taxation. In this way, landed magnates could build up resources outside the immediate reach of the central bureaucracy. They relied on warriors to protect these estates, to collect revenue, and to maintain the lord's power in the face of rivals. This arrangement drew the samurai class more firmly into local governance. They were no longer merely temporary guards. They became the managers, the enforcers, and the military backbone of regional authority. Religion and philosophy also played a part in shaping what it meant to be a warrior. Indigenous Shinto beliefs emphasized ritual, community obligations, and kinship ties. Shrines served as centers of local religious life. Families traced their origins and honors through ancestral lines, and ritual practice reinforced social order. Meanwhile, ideas and texts from the Asian continent reached Japan and left a lasting mark. Confucian thought, for instance, brought a vocabulary for discussing duty, hierarchy, and proper conduct within social relationships. Legalist ideas influenced administrative thinking about law and governance. Buddhism arrived from Korea and China, and it offered new models of discipline, meditation, and moral consideration. Over time, different Buddhist schools, including those that emphasized meditation and direct practice, became associated with the warrior class. In this way, spiritual practices and ethical frameworks blended with martial life. Warriors learned to balance public duty with inward discipline. They followed codes of personal conduct that valued loyalty and honor, while also engaging in ritual observance and study. The Heian period, which began in 794 CE, provides a clear example of how these developments came together. The capital moved to Heian in 794 CE, and court culture flourished around poetry, ceremony, and refined aesthetics. The court relied on aristocratic families to manage civil administration, and it produced elaborate systems of rank. At the same time, the reach of central control did not extend evenly across all provinces. Many provincial districts remained under the influence of local magnates. These local leaders hired armed men to protect their fields and to collect rents. Among those armed men were members of families that would later be called samurai. During the Heian period, the term saburai, meaning attendants or those who serve, was used for those who performed military and protective functions for nobles. They were still tied closely to household service. They accompanied nobles, they guarded estates, and they oversaw conflicts among local rivals. Meanwhile, two clans rose to particular prominence in the latter part of the Heian period: the Taira and the Minamoto. These families accumulated power through military success and through strategic marriages. Over time, their influence extended beyond the provinces into the politics of the capital itself. Conflict between these clans escalated slowly at first, and then more sharply. The Taira and the Minamoto fought for control of influence at court and across the provinces. This competition culminated in a series of battles known as the Genpei War. When the war ended in 1185 CE, the political landscape had changed. The victorious Minamoto leader established a new center of political authority in the east. In this way, power shifted away from the court in Heian and toward a military government. The leader who had organized this new system was granted the title of Sei Taishogun, in 1192 CE. That title, usually shortened to shogun, identified a military ruler with authority over other military leaders. The establishment of the Kamakura government after 1185 CE marked the beginning of a new political order. The samurai now stood at the center of governance rather than at its periphery. Under the Kamakura regime, the institutional role of the warrior class became more formalized. The shogunate oversaw military matters, land distribution, and legal disputes involving samurai. Local lords were expected to provide military service to their superiors. Retainers swore oaths of loyalty and received land or stipends in return. Over time, the rules of succession, inheritance, and responsibility were developed to manage these relationships. The warrior class also adapted cultural practices to fit their position. Rituals of hospitality and codes of conduct expressed expectations about loyalty and courage. Written documents recorded agreements and clarified duties. Meanwhile, samurai continued to practice skills of arms. Horse-mounted archery remained important for some time. Swordsmanship grew in skill and significance. Armor and battlefield tactics evolved to meet changing demands. Alongside these practical matters, many samurai engaged with cultural and religious life. They supported temples and shrines, and they sometimes took part in poetry and learning. In this way, the samurai of the Kamakura period were both fighters and participants in broader social life. The transition from the Heian to the Kamakura era did not erase the earlier layers of society. Administrative forms, court ceremonials, and religious institutions persisted. Samurai adapted existing institutions to new purposes. They negotiated with court nobles and temple authorities. They mediated disputes and enforced policies. Meanwhile, the existence of private estates continued to shape how power was organized across the country. Over time, the samurai would develop a clearer self-understanding and a more distinct cultural identity. Even so, the process was gradual. It involved local practices, regional differences, and the shifting priorities of powerful families. When we look back at these centuries, certain patterns stand out. First, the rise of warrior clans was rooted in local realities: land, labor, and the need for protection. Second, the movement from imperial guards to provincial lords shows how authority adapted to practical needs on the ground. Third, spiritual and philosophical influences provided frameworks of duty and discipline that could be drawn upon by warriors as they defined their roles. Finally, the Heian and Kamakura periods reveal how institutions and personal bonds combined to create a military class that would shape Japanese history for centuries. In this way, the origins of the samurai are neither simple nor sudden. They reflect a long process of social change, of local initiative, and of cultural integration. There were many individuals and many small choices that together formed this history. Some families chose to invest in military skill. Others focused on administration. Some regional leaders forged alliances through marriage, and others did so through force. Each decision added a thread to a broader pattern. Over time, those threads bound together into the recognizable social role of the samurai. Their rise was connected to land and to service, to ritual and to discipline. The developments in these early centuries set the terms for what would follow in later eras. They established structures of loyalty, and expectation. They shaped how power was exercised and how communities were protected. In this way, the earliest samurai emerged from the practical needs of life in the provinces, from the rituals of court and shrine, and from ideas that crossed the sea into Japan. As the centuries continued, the samurai adapted to new challenges and to new forms of governance. Yet the foundations laid in those early times remained visible. The bonds between lord and retainer, the management of private estates, and the blending of martial practice with ethical consideration endured. The story of the samurai's origins is a story of gradual formation. It is a story of households that organized armed service, of courts that allocated titles, and of religious and philosophical currents that offered principles for conduct. Taken together, these elements created a class that would come to define much of Japan's medieval period. The process was deliberate and incremental. In this way, the samurai did not appear fully formed. They evolved, step by step, as a response to the needs and opportunities of their time. The phrase, "the way of the warrior," has a simple sound. It also carries a long history. In Japanese, the term often translated as "the way of the warrior" became known as Bushido. At its core, it names a set of expectations and practices associated with those who served as military retainers. Over many centuries, the meaning of this phrase changed as social conditions changed. It was not a single, fixed code handed down in one piece. Instead, it grew from customs, legal requirements, religious ideas, and the practical demands of life for a samurai, and for the communities they protected. In this telling, I will describe how the idea of Bushido evolved, the values that were central to it, the relationship of life and death within that ethic, and the ways it influenced Japanese identity and discipline. In the earliest phases, warriors were household attendants and provincial guards. Their duties were often local and practical. They fought when needed. They guarded estates and escorted important persons. Legal documents and household rules laid out some expectations for conduct, and those expectations emphasized service to a lord and the preservation of order. Over time, as military families became more central to political life, other norms developed. Loyalty to a lord became more pronounced. Military skill and courage were admired. Meanwhile, religious and philosophical currents supplied words and concepts that shaped how warriors thought about their role. Confucian notions of duty and hierarchical relationships and Buddhist teachings about detachment and discipline entered the mix. In this way, Bushido came to include both outward duties and inward practices. During the period when military government became established, in the centuries following the late 12th century CE, the samurai class gained new institutional responsibilities. Courts led by military rulers adjudicated disputes among warriors and set rules for behavior. Retainers were expected to manage estates, to enforce decisions, and to provide military service when called. The demands of that position created a social need for consistent standards of conduct. In response, families and clans developed rituals of allegiance, formal oaths, and systems of reward and punishment. These systems gave substance to the idea that a warrior's identity included obligations that extended beyond immediate self-interest. In this way, honor and loyalty found a practical expression. Honor had multiple dimensions for a samurai. It included personal reputation within a local community. It also included public standing before peers and superiors. Over time, written codes and customary practice stressed the importance of maintaining a clear sense of duty. A warrior was expected to keep his promises and to act in ways that preserved family standing. Disgrace was not only an individual matter, it could bring shame to the household and to those connected by ties of obligation. For that reason, many rituals focused on repair and prevention. Apologies, restitution, and public demonstration of contrition were ways to regain standing when mistakes were made. At the same time, some failures were judged as irredeemable, and social pressure made certain forms of atonement appear necessary. Loyalty to a lord stood at the center of Bushido as it developed. This bond was personal and reciprocal. A lord provided protection, status, and income. A retainer offered military service, counsel, and fidelity. The strength of that bond depended on mutual recognition of roles and on collective enforcement of expectations. Over long periods, the idea of loyalty expanded beyond narrow personal ties to encompass institutional fidelity. Warriors came to think in terms of serving an office, a house, or a polity. Meanwhile, philosophical resources helped give shape to the idea of loyalty. Confucian writings, translated and adapted in different eras, supplied vocabulary about proper relationships within a hierarchy. In this way, loyalty was not only a military duty, it also became a moral category that articulated a place for the individual within a larger social order. The spiritual weight of duty was a central concern. Buddhist teachings, especially those associated with schools that emphasized discipline and meditation, influenced many warriors. Practices of self-examination and training that came from monastic settings found analogs in the daily routines of samurai. They cultivated calmness under pressure, attention to the present task, and a measured acceptance of loss. These inward practices did not remove the outward responsibilities of the warrior. Instead, they reinforced an ability to carry those responsibilities with steadiness. Moreover, ritual observance linked warriors to local religious life. Shrines and temples were sites of patronage and reflection. In this way, the spiritual dimension of duty served both personal discipline and public order. The connection between life and death in the samurai ethic demands careful attention. A defining feature of Bushido, as it is often described, is a readiness to face death. That readiness was not meant to be a reckless desire for violence. Rather, it represented a state of mind in which fear of dishonor was weighed against the obligations of duty. Over time, certain practices became associated with this condition. The act of ritual self-disembowelment, known in Japanese as seppuku, was performed under specific circumstances. It served as a form of atonement and as a demonstration of resolve. When a warrior chose this course, the act communicated accountability and an acknowledgement of failure or defeat. In other cases, dying in battle while serving a lord was seen as a legitimate fulfillment of duty. Both the public acknowledgement of death and the private cultivation of composure were taught and rehearsed. Self-control was central to the connection between life and death. Warriors trained to manage their emotions in ways that were judged useful for practical decision-making. Fear, anger, and haste could lead to mistakes in combat, and in administration. For that reason, disciplines that encouraged measured responses were prized. Training in martial techniques contributed to this aim. Repetition, attention to form, and close mentorship developed physical steadiness. At the same time, study of texts, moral instruction within households, and ritual practice promoted mental steadiness. Over time, the ideal of a composed mind became associated with moral strength. This association shaped how samurai judged both their own conduct and the conduct of others. Bushido also influenced how the samurai related to learning and culture. Contrary to a narrow image of warriors as only fighters, many samurai embraced cultural forms as part of their training. The tea ceremony, calligraphy, poetry, and study of history and law were included in education for those who occupied leadership positions. These activities were valued because they refined manners and judgment. They also provided a language for discussing moral problems. In this way, cultural practice became part of ethical formation. A well-ordered household required not only military skill, but also administrative ability and cultivated judgment. Over time, participation in these practices reinforced the social standing of the samurai and helped define their public persona. The influence of Bushido on Japanese identity and discipline changed over long stretches of history. During times when the warrior class held formal political power, the values associated with Bushido were institutionalized through law, ceremony, and education. Authorities promoted loyalty, proper conduct, and public service. Meanwhile, local communities regulated behavior through custom and expectation. Over the long term, these practices contributed to a broader cultural respect for order and for fulfillment of social roles. Schools and official systems of examination and appointment adopted elements that rewarded discipline and adherence to duty. In this way, habits associated with the samurai had effects beyond the military class itself. The modern era brought significant transformations. During the 19th century CE, political changes ended the old system of hereditary military government. The Meiji Restoration in 1868 CE abolished many feudal institutions and created a modern, centralized state. Under the new order, the state sought to create a national army and to instill a sense of collective duty to the nation. In this period, leaders and intellectuals drew on older ideas about samurai conduct and reframed them for a modern polity. Manuals and essays about the way of the warrior were published and read in new contexts. Some writers emphasized loyalty to the nation rather than to an individual lord. Others stressed self-discipline and public service as civic virtues. In this way, certain elements of Bushido were adapted to serve modern state building. At the same time, these adaptations were not without problems. The rhetoric of loyalty and sacrifice was sometimes used to justify political aims that did not reflect the original social conditions of samurai service. During times of conflict in the 20th century CE, appeals to a code of duty were mobilized to encourage sacrifice for the state. After these events, many thinkers and leaders reflected critically on how the language of the warrior had been used. They debated which elements of tradition were life-affirming and which had been distorted. In this way, the history of Bushido in the modern era is also a history of contested interpretation. In daily life, the discipline associated with Bushido had practical consequences. Household management, training of retainers, and the education of heirs required routines and standards. Warriors had to balance defense and administration. They had to care for families and households while upholding public duties. Rituals of respect toward elders and superiors regulated social interaction. Courtesy, punctuality, and careful speech were marks of good training. Over time, such habits contributed to stable institutions of local governance. They also shaped expectations of behavior in many spheres of life. Finally, it is important to remember that Bushido was not a single monolithic code followed uniformly by all samurai. Regional differences, family traditions, and historical circumstances produced variation. Some households emphasized martial skill more heavily. Others prioritized administrative competence or cultural learning. Individual samurai differed in temperament and preference. In this way of the warrior included a range of practices and ideals rather than a single pattern. When we consider the meaning of Bushido, then, we see a complex history. It is a history of social needs and moral reflection. It is a history of practices that combined outward duty with inward discipline. Honor and loyalty stood at its center. The spiritual dimension made duty a personal matter as well as a public one. The connection between life and death encouraged self-control and clear judgment. Over time, these elements shaped not only the lives of samurai, but also broader patterns of social discipline and identity. In this way of the warrior became an enduring set of ideas and habits, adapted to new circumstances, questioned in others, and remembered in many forms. Training and discipline. A samurai's life began with training almost as soon as he could walk. In many households, the education of children was organized by the family as a whole. Mothers, fathers, elders, and senior retainers all took part. Boys were taught manners, basic reading, and simple rules about duty and loyalty from a very young age. Girls in samurai families received instruction tailored to their expected roles, including household management and etiquette. Over time, those early lessons formed the foundation for more specialized instruction. Instruction started with small tasks that required attention and care. Children learned to bow correctly, to address elders with the proper words, and to keep their living spaces orderly. These tasks were repeated until they became habits. Meanwhile, they were introduced to stories of family ancestors and to basic laws and customs that governed their household. In this way, cultural memory and legal expectation entered daily life early. As they grew, boys were given simple equipment for practice. Wooden swords and small shields served as tools for learning form and posture. Care for these items taught respect for tools and for the objects of one's trade. Formal schooling varied by time and place. Some households maintained private tutors and formal lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Others relied on instruction through practical tasks and apprenticeship. Confucian texts, histories, and legal materials were studied where available. Calligraphy was practiced as a way to refine hand and mind together. Over time, both literary knowledge and practical knowledge came to be seen as part of a competent leader's training. A retainer expected to manage estates needed to read official documents, keep accounts, and issue orders. For this reason, intellectual study was often paired with physical training. Physical training began in earnest as children entered their early teens. Martial arts schools provided systematic instruction in fighting techniques. Swordsmanship was central. Students learned stances, footwork, striking angles, and how to maintain balance while moving. Training often proceeded in stages. Beginners practiced basic forms or sequences of movement. As skills advanced, instructors taught paired drills and sparring. These drills were controlled and structured. They emphasized timing and accuracy rather than uncontrolled force. Over years of practice, techniques were refined through repetition and correction. Archery was another important skill. The Japanese longbow, known as the yumi, required both strength and a particular form. Archery lessons began with posture and the way of holding the bow. Students learned to draw smoothly and to release cleanly. They practiced aiming at stationary targets and later at moving targets. Horseback archery combined two difficult skills. Learning to ride and to shoot at the same time required coordination and confidence. Teachers broke the work into parts. They taught riding first, then shooting from a static horse, and finally shooting while moving. Each step was practiced until it could be performed without hesitation. Horseback training went beyond archery. Samurai needed to be comfortable on a horse in many situations. They learned to mount and dismount quickly, to move with the animal, and to handle weapons while riding. Horses were cared for as part of the training. Grooming, feeding, and simple veterinary attention were tasks that retainers often performed. In this way, close practical knowledge of animals became part of the martial skill set. Close combat systems were studied alongside weapon use. Jujutsu, spear work, and polearm techniques were common. Instructors taught how to defend when unarmed and how to use shorter weapons in confined spaces. Students practiced throws, locks, and holds designed to control an opponent without relying solely on lethal force. Training halls or dojos provided spaces for repeated practice. Floors were swept, equipment was kept orderly, and rules of conduct were observed. Respect for one's partner and for the instructor governed attention in the hall. Training methods emphasized repetition, measured progression, and the correction of error. A single movement was practiced many times until it could be performed smoothly. In this way, the body learned patterns that the mind could then rely upon in stress. Teachers corrected posture and timing through direct guidance. Over time, students internalized feedback and adjusted their movement accordingly. Success in training was not only technical skill. It included patience, the ability to accept correction, and a steady willingness to return to basic forms. Meditation and the influence of Zen Buddhism entered the training of many samurai as an inward complement to outward skill. Zen practices emphasized sitting meditation, or zazen, and an attentive awareness of the present task. Instructors familiar with these practices taught students how to sit with a straight back, to attend to the breath, and to allow thoughts to pass without attachment. The aim was not to produce passivity. Instead, meditation trained attention, steadiness, and clarity of mind. Over time, these qualities helped warriors remain composed under pressure. Zen instruction sometimes included short, repeated exercises designed to sharpen focus. Students might be asked to attend to a single action, such as drawing a bow or stepping forward, and to notice each detail. This practice linked meditation and movement. In that way, the mind that learned to sit calmly could also respond calmly in action. Teachers offered specific guidance. They corrected posture, breathing, and the quality of attention in the same practical way that a sword master corrected a cut. Koan practice and formal study of Zen texts were part of advanced instruction in some households. A koan is a short, often paradoxical question or statement meant to disrupt ordinary patterns of thinking. Students worked through these problems with a teacher in private interviews. The aim was to cultivate a direct form of insight and to loosen attachment to habitual mental patterns. Over time, such practices contributed to mental flexibility and to an ability to act without hesitation when circumstances required it. Discipline in everyday life reflected these inward practices. Mealtimes, sleep, and work were regulated. Silence had an important role. During training, speech was often limited to necessary instruction. In that quiet, students learned to listen with attention and to observe carefully. Meanwhile, patience was cultivated not only through meditation, but through long-term engagement with tasks that changed little from day to day. Armor cleaning, sword maintenance, and the repetitive study of forms required the same steady care as formal meditation. In this way, physical chores became extensions of inner discipline. Repetition worked alongside patience to shape judgment. Students returned to basic techniques again and again. When an error appeared, instructors did not merely shout or scold. They corrected the movement and assigned further practice. Small improvements accumulated. Over months and years, those increments led to reliable performance in demanding situations. A steady daily practice produced a level of competence that could be trusted. This form of training reduced the need for panic when unpredictable events occurred. In this way, repetition served both skill and composure. Silence functioned in multiple ways. It reduced distraction and allowed a learner to notice small details. It communicated respect in the training hall. It also protected information. Certain techniques and tactical knowledge were confined to household circles, and silence helped keep them so. On a personal level, restraint in speech prevented rash promises and helped maintain social harmony. Silence did not mean absence of feeling. Rather, it allowed emotion to be examined and controlled before action. Over time, a measured silence became part of a samurai's public demeanor. Patience also appeared in timing practices. Waiting to strike until an opening appeared was taught as much as the strike itself. Teachers emphasized that haste often led to mistakes. Students practiced waiting in the proper stance, observing an opponent's movement, and responding when the correct moment came. The right timing depended on calm observation and on trust in one's training. In this way, patience combined with repetition to produce precise action. Rituals reinforced these habits. The tea ceremony, for example, brought together quiet attention, careful repetition, and exact timing. A host prepared the room, cleaned utensils, and performed each movement with deliberate care. Guests followed prescribed patterns of behavior. Over time, participation in such rituals trained individuals to value attentive and measured conduct. Administrative tasks also functioned as training. Keeping records, managing household finances, and overseeing retainers required steady attention to routine and to detail. Mentorship was central to this process. A young samurai typically apprenticed under a senior retainer or family instructor. That relationship involved daily oversight. The mentor corrected mistakes, assigned practice, and explained the reasons behind rules. Counsel and example were often more influential than formal lectures. In private instruction, teachers adapted training to a student's temperament. Where a learner needed encouragement, lessons were paced accordingly. Where more rigor was required, training was intensified. This tailored guidance helped students move from imitation to mastery. Progress was often measured by milestones rather than by examination alone. Public demonstrations, supervised sparring, and family approval marked advancement. Over time, a retainer who had shown steadiness in training might be given greater responsibilities in administration or in military command. Such assignments tested both skill and character. In this way, training extended beyond the hall and into the practical demands of governance and warfare. Injury and recovery were part of the discipline. Training could be hard, and accidents occurred. Treatment of wounds and time for rehabilitation were practical matters. During recovery, students were expected to maintain mental discipline. They read, practiced calligraphy, or engaged in meditation. Maintaining steady conduct during illness or injury was itself a sign of training. As political conditions changed over the centuries, so did aspects of training. When times of peace prevailed, greater emphasis often fell on cultural disciplines and administrative training. Martial practice continued, but it was balanced with study and household duties. In times of conflict, training sharpened toward battlefield effectiveness. In either case, the central elements remained: repeated practice, patient attention, and control of speech and action. Taken together, these elements produced a character suited to public service and to the unpredictable demands of life in a martial society. Early education taught basic duty and manners. Physical skills provided practical competence in combat and in administration. Meditation and Zen practices cultivated calm attention. Patience, repetition, and silence formed the steady habits that made skill reliable. Over time, a samurai's training shaped not only his abilities, but also his way of being in the world. In this way, discipline and practice were not ends in themselves. They prepared a person for duties that required steadiness, judgment, and the capacity to act when necessary. Armor, weapons, and warfare were practical matters for a samurai, and they were also expressions of social order and belief. In daily life, a warrior's equipment declared rank and responsibility. In battle, it determined survival. Over time, the forms of armor and the designs of weapons changed with technology and with shifting political conditions. Meanwhile, beliefs about the meaning and value of these objects shaped how they were made, how they were cared for, and how they were used. Construction of samurai armor combined metalworking, leathercraft, textile work, and lacquer. Early forms developed from simple iron plates and leather bound to a garment. Later types became more elaborate. One well-known design is the great armor called oyore, used by mounted warriors in earlier centuries. It had a boxy cuirass and wide shoulder guards meant to protect a mounted archer. Another common form is the domaru, a closer-fitting cuirass that allowed greater mobility for foot combat. Over time, smaller variations appeared, including armored sleeves called coat, thigh guards called haidate, shin guards known as sunniate, and flexible mail or small plate pieces called karuta and kusari. The kabuto helmet was a central piece. It included a bowl of iron plates, often riveted or welded, and a neck guard called a shikaro. Many helmets carried a crest or ornament on the front, and a face mask, the menpo, that covered the lower face and helped secure the helmet while also protecting the throat. Materials mattered. Smiths used iron plates and sometimes steel for key areas. Leather was layered and hardened. Silk cords threaded through small holes bound plates together in lacing called odoshi. Lacquer sealed surfaces, reduced rust, and waterproofed leather. It also allowed color and finish. In this way, armor served both functional and visual purposes. Swords, helmets, and chest pieces often bore a family crest, or mon. These crests identified a warrior's household on the field and in camp. Over time, color schemes and crest choices became part of a household's visual language, and the armor itself was treated as an heirloom to be repaired and passed down. Symbolic elements were woven into the construction and decoration. Religious texts and talismans were sometimes placed inside helmets or beneath lamellar plates. A warrior might carry a small cloth or amulet for protection, and a priest could bless armor before a campaign. Decorations also reflected status. A wealthy lord could invest in elaborate lacquer work, gilding, and a finely shaped helmet crest. Meanwhile, other households emphasized practical repair and solid construction. In this way, armor expressed both faith and hierarchy, and it reflected the priorities of different times and places. The katana occupies a central place in discussions of weaponry. Its form, method of construction, and cultural meaning changed over many centuries. Swordsmiths used a specialized steel called tamahagin, produced in a clay and charcoal smelting furnace called a tatara. The produced steel contained variable amounts of carbon. To create a balanced blade, smiths folded and forged the steel repeatedly. Folding served to equalize carbon content and to remove impurities. Over many cycles of heating, hammering, and folding, layers formed in the metal. Later work involved combining a harder high-carbon steel for the cutting edge with a softer, tougher steel for the spine. A thin layer of clay was applied to the blade before quenching. When the sword was heated and then rapidly cooled in water, the edge hardened more than the spine. This process produced a visible temper line on the finished blade, known in Japanese as the hamon. Polishing followed forging. A specialized polisher, called a tajishi, used a sequence of abrasive stones to refine the geometry, sharpen the edge, and bring out the hamon and grain pattern. Polishing required great care. Too aggressive a movement could change the blade's geometry or introduce weakness. A finished katana was then fitted with a guard, or tsuba, and a hilt wrapped around a ray skin core called sengawa. The wrapping, tsukamaki, used cord to secure the grip and to provide tactile feedback in use. The scabbard, or saya, was shaped from wood and lacquered. A cord, the seigyo, tied the scabbard to a belt or to a mounted saddle. Care of a sword was a continuous duty. The blade required cleaning and oiling to prevent rust. Sword oil, commonly a clove oil mixture in later periods, was gently applied after wiping the metal clean. When blades were not in use, they were often hung in a place where humidity was reduced. The practice of regular inspection and cleaning was practical. and it also carried ritual significance. Families often treated valued swords as ancestral items, and they displayed care as a form of respect. Over time, some swords became named and recorded in household inventories. Masters commissioned blades from recognized smiths, and smithing schools developed recognizable styles. Swords held symbolic meaning beyond material form. Warriors and households attributed to them a place in social ritual and in honor practices. The pairing of a long sword and a short sword, called the daisho, signified a samurai's right to bear arms. In certain contexts, a sword could be a sign of office. In private, some believed that a sword could house a spirit or act as a focus for ancestral memory. It is important to describe these beliefs as practices and social facts, rather than as metaphors. For many, the sword's presence structured how a person approached duty, and it guided behavior in moments of crisis. Weapons other than the katana also played crucial roles. The yari spear was effective in massed formations and in defense of fortifications. Polearms and naginata blades were used by infantry and by some cavalry in particular roles. Firearms changed the nature of warfare when they arrived. In the year 1543 CE, Portuguese traders introduced matchlock firearms to Japan. Known as Tangashima after an island associated with the exchange, these matchlocks were quickly adopted and adapted. Ashigaru foot soldiers, who previously fought with spears and bows, began to use firearms. Over time, volley tactics and fortified firing lines emerged. Meanwhile, archery and mounted combat retained roles that suited certain terrains and tactical situations. Battle formations reflected available weapons and the terrain of engagement. Early campaigns often relied on mounted archers. Warriors controlled ground from horseback while firing arrows at an approaching enemy. Later, especially in the long 16th century of internal conflict, massed infantry tactics came to the fore. Commanders organized ashigaru into units armed with spears, who could present a wall of points against cavalry. When firearms became common, commanders arranged ranks for volley fire and used rotating lines to maintain a steady rate of fire. Fortifications altered tactics. Castles, field palisades, and earthworks forced attackers to invest time in siegecraft. Engineers and laborers built defenses, while commanders prepared for assaults, feints, and supply interdiction. Communication on the field depended on visual and auditory signals. Banners called sashimono identified units and helped maintain formation, while larger flags and standards informed movements at a higher level. Drums and conch horns provided timing for charges and changes in formation. Commanders used messengers who ran or rode between units, and they relied on scouts to report on the enemy's position. Logistics mattered. A campaign required food, fodder, and tools for armor and weapon repair. Meanwhile, units on the move practiced discipline about noise, camp layout, and guard duties to protect supply trains. Tactics also included deception and careful timing. Ambushes exploited local knowledge. Feigned retreats invited pursuit and then drew opponents into prepared traps. Night movements tested the ability of a force to maintain order in darkness. Meanwhile, commanders sought to exploit morale. A well-timed charge or a sudden volley could break opposing ranks. In contrast, sieges required patience. Attackers used ladders, scaling devices, or undermining techniques, while defenders relied on missile fire, boiling liquids, and controlled sallies. In this way, warfare required both immediate action and long-term planning. The emotional reality of war differed from the technical descriptions of armor and tactics. Combat produced fear, and it produced hardship. Soldiers on campaign faced long marches, cold nights, and limited rations. Wounds were common, and recovery could be slow. During and after battle, many witnessed severe injury and death. Practices for treating the wounded included basic field medicine, wound cleaning, and months of rehabilitation for those who survived. When death occurred, families and comrades observed mourning rituals. Heads taken on the field were sometimes presented as proof of victory, cataloged, and offered for reward. This practice had clear social and economic consequences. It also shaped how warriors thought about risk and about the public display of success. Personal duels offered a different emotional tone from mass combat, though they could be no less dangerous. In some periods and places, a duel was an arranged test of skill between two warriors. Rules could be strict. Witnesses might attend. Sometimes the duel settled questions of honor, property, or command. In other settings, single combats occurred during the disorder of battle, and they were less formal. The winner might take a head, the loser might be killed. Meanwhile, ritual suicide, most often seppuku, had a specific social function. When a person accepted responsibility for failure or sought to avoid capture and shame, seppuku provided a regulated form of self-injury and death within a formal context that included attendance and procedures. These practices reflected a complex moral code that linked personal action to family reputation and to social expectation. Beyond the immediate physical risks, warfare affected mental life. Long campaigns created stress and confusion. Survivors carried memories of violence. Over time, communities developed ways to mark those losses. Temples offered prayers for the dead. Families established memorial tablets. In some households, veterans who had seen many battles assumed roles as instructors or administrators, where their experience could be useful. In this way, the consequences of war shaped later social arrangements, as well as individual lives. Armor and weapons reflected these social and emotional realities. They protected bodies, they identified households, and they carried meaning beyond their material construction. Care and maintenance took time and attention, and that work expressed both practical concerns and social habits. In camp and in the home, the processes of repair and cleaning kept tools ready, and they kept memory alive. Over generations, smiths, armorers, and artisans refined methods, and families preserved objects as records of service. The connections between equipment, ritual, and operational practice created a consistent pattern. While technology and tactics changed, the association of material objects with duty, honor, and daily practice remained steady. Finally, it is important to register how changes in political life altered the role of arms and armor. During extended peace, such as the long peace under centralized rule in later centuries, warriors shifted emphasis toward household administration, ceremonial display, and cultural practice. Armor became both protective gear and a part of formal dress. Weapons continued to be symbols of status. In times of intense conflict, by contrast, the practical demands of survival and of battlefield effectiveness dominated. Commanders sought innovations, and common soldiers adapted to new weapons and formations. In each context, the material practices around armor and weapons responded to social need, to technical possibility, and to the human emotions that accompanied the experience of war. Over time, this practical and symbolic web shaped the way samurai lived, fought, and remembered. Life in a castle and in the surrounding domain was organized around duties that were often steady and administrative rather than violent. In times of peace, the visible tasks of a samurai changed shape. Sword practice and military exercises continued, but they occupied less of the day than paperwork, supervision, and procedures of governance. A lord's household required constant attention. In this setting, a samurai's identity adjusted to the needs of management and order. He served as an official, an inspector, a legal officer, a teacher, and sometimes as a tax collector. These roles required literacy, record keeping, and a sense of responsibility to maintain daily functions. A castle was a center of administration. It contained the lord's residence, storehouses, treasuries, and the rooms where senior advisors met. Courtyards and corridors gave access to offices where documents were prepared and where petitions were received. In this way, the castle was a place of decisions. Magistrates and senior retainers heard disputes brought by peasants or merchants. They recorded agreements and fines. Meanwhile, clerks kept accounts of rice, money, and supplies. Registers listed household names, stipends, and obligations. Over time, this system multiplied into a network of offices that linked the castle to villages across the domain. Responsibilities as administrators extended beyond the castle walls. A domain, or han, was an economic and political unit with its own farms, towns, roads, and waterways. Samurai served on local councils that set policy for irrigation, forest management, and road maintenance. They directed labor for public works. When embankments needed repair after heavy rain, samurai organized crews and allocated resources. When granaries required redistribution to prevent famine in a poor year, officials determined quantities and oversaw transport. In this way, the samurai acted as managers of a working territory, and their tasks required knowledge of logistics, seasons, and rhythms of agricultural life. Legal duties fell to those samurai charged with administration. Village disputes about land boundaries, inheritance, or theft were common. A magistrate examined testimony, measured plots, and consulted older records. Rules varied by place, but procedures aimed for an orderly resolution. Sentences ranged from fines to mandated labor service. Sometimes punishment involved confinement or corporal penalties. In other instances, the magistrate brokered compromise. This work demanded a steady hand. The effective samurai administrator balanced enforcement with practical concessions that kept production and social order stable. Protection remained an important responsibility even in stable times. Castles stood as deterrents to rebellion, and garrisons were maintained. Guard rotations, night watches, and patrols continued. Samurai supervised city gates, watched marketplaces, and checked the movement of people and goods. In times of emergency such as fires, uprisings, or bandit raids, they were the first organized responders. They coordinated firefighting crews, organized armed patrols, and enforced curfews. Fire was a particular danger in castle towns. Samurai directed building regulations, ordered the clearing of flammable materials near important structures, and enforced standards for watchmen. In this way, their protective role took a preventive and supervisory form as much as a combative one. Financial responsibility was central to a samurai's life in a domain. Their own income was often fixed in rice, measured in units called koku. A koku was the amount of rice thought sufficient to feed one person for a year. Stipends could be converted into cash for daily expenses, but the conversion exposed samurai households to market forces. Over time, inflation and the growth of cash economies strained these stipends. A samurai household had to manage stores, arrange sales, and sometimes borrow money or accept clothes and rice in lieu of cash payments. Senior retainers managed domain treasuries. They balanced income from taxes with expenditures for public works, stipends, and the cost of hosting the lord's obligations. In this way, fiscal administration shaped daily priorities. Relations with peasants were structured by duties on both sides. Peasants paid taxes in rice and performed labor services in times of need. A samurai's obligation was to protect those peasants whose lands supplied the domain's livelihood. He visited villages to inspect fields, to check irrigation channels, and to record yields during harvest. When a poor harvest occurred, samurai officials might order reduced tax payments or authorize grain distribution from public reserves. At the same time, peasants relied on the samurai to enforce order, to provide clear boundaries, and to adjudicate disputes. This created a relationship that was both practical and hierarchical. Respect and distance coexisted with repeated interaction. Artisans and merchants formed another part of the social fabric that samurai managed. Castle towns contained workshops for carpenters, armorers, swordsmiths, potters, and cloth dyers. These craftsmen supplied the everyday needs of the castle and the domain. Samurai officials inspected guild activities, licensed workshops, and sometimes directed production for the lord's use. Armories and smithies required supervision to ensure that weapons and tools were available and that important repairs were completed. Meanwhile, merchants maintained market stalls and warehouses. Samurai regulated prices, collected duties at market gates, and settled disputes involving contracts or quality of goods. In this way, the samurai were patrons and regulators, relying on artisans for material goods while enforcing rules for the wider economy. Social relations carried conventions and expectations. Samurai were expected to uphold family honor and to act as exemplars of discipline. They lived in assigned quarters that separated them from peasants and artisans, and these arrangements reinforced social distance. At the same time, everyday contact was routine. A samurai might sit in a local tea house to discuss business with a merchant, or he might give orders to a carpenter in the workshop behind the castle. Children of samurai learned reading and calculation to prepare for administrative work. In domain schools, known as hanko or hand schools, sons received instruction in Confucian texts, calligraphy, and the mathematics needed for estate management. Over time, these schools created a professional class skilled in governance rather than only in combat. Cultural duties filled time when battle was absent. Ceremonies, rituals, and seasonal observances took place in the castle, and in village shrines. Samurai attended formal audiences, participated in rites to mark planting and harvest, and engaged in practices that affirmed social order. They trained in arts valued by their class. Calligraphy and poetry were not mere hobbies. They functioned as methods of self-discipline and as markers of education. The tea ceremony, with its precise procedures, provided a setting for political conversation and for the display of refinement. In this way, cultural activity reinforced the administrative role and offered a disciplined counterpart to the physical practice of arms. The contrast between war and routine life was both practical and psychological. In battle, actions were immediate, decisions compressed, and survival was at stake. Training prepared men for such moments, but most samurai never spent long periods in active warfare during an extended peace. Instead, their days were measured by reports, ledgers, and meetings. Drills and sword practice persisted, partly to maintain readiness and partly as tradition. Over time, the content of training adjusted. Some martial exercises emphasized individual skill, while others focused on ceremony. The difference between the polished conduct required in court and the rough activity of campaign life was clear. Yet the ideal of martial competence remained a baseline expectation. Practical preparations for war continued as a background part of life. Armor and weapons were maintained in storehouses. Training grounds remained available, and experienced commanders wrote manuals that described tactics and maneuvers. When threats emerged, samurai could mobilize garrisons, call on peasant conscripts, and prepare defensive works. In this sense, a domain existed with an eye to possible conflict. Meanwhile, everyday life ensured that the economy and the social order would sustain a prolonged defense if necessary. Supplies were stockpiled, granaries inventoried, and escape or defense routes identified. Emotional life varied with these roles. Administrators bore burdens that were less visible than the dramatic image of battle, but they were significant. Decisions about taxes, conscription, and punishment affected many lives. A flawed decision could produce resentment and unrest. Senior samurai carried responsibility for the livelihood of thousands. They faced moral dilemmas when resources were scarce. At times, these responsibilities led samurai to act with prudence, and at other times to overreach. The social norms of accountability and honor placed pressure on them to manage well, and to accept blame when necessary. Daily routines were steady and detailed. A typical day might begin with inspection of written reports. Then, a samurai could attend a council meeting where matters of harvest, trade, and policing were discussed. He might walk through the castle town to view market activity, speak with a master craftsman about repairs, and later sit with a village head to confirm rice accounts. Afternoons could include training in the dojo, instruction of apprentices, or the delivery of orders to distant outposts. Evenings were for family, for the cleaning of armor and swords, and for reflection on the day's work. In this way, time was divided between public duties and private maintenance. Over long spans, political change altered these patterns. When centralized rule brought long peace to many regions, the emphasis on administration and ceremony deepened. Some samurai adapted well and became capable civil servants. Others found the restrictions of status and stipend difficult to reconcile with rising costs and a growing cash economy. This produced a range of responses. Some took up teaching, medicine, or art to supplement income. Others became debtors and faced social decline. In certain domains, reforms attempted to rationalize finances, to encourage new industries, or to reduce wasteful expenditure. Meanwhile, the everyday function of samurai as administrators and protectors continued. In the final account, life in the castle and the domain reflects a steady set of obligations. A samurai's role in peace was complex and practical. He protected and managed, supervised production, enforced local rules, and acted as a link between lord and people. Relations with peasants and artisans combined duty with oversight. Routine life emphasized records, rituals, and care for material things. When war returned, these structures were available to convert into defense. In this way, the samurai's world combined the needs of governance with the enduring requirement to be ready for conflict. And it did so through a slow and systematic set of daily practices. Family life stood at the center of a samurai's world. It shaped obligations, daily routines, and long-term plans. Marriage and lineage provided a framework for social stability. In practice, this meant that family decisions were rarely private matters. They connected households to a wider network of allies, to the lord of the domain, and to the economic needs of the estate. Arranged marriages were common. Families negotiated matches to secure alliances, to consolidate land or income, and to protect the family's future. Meanwhile, parents and senior relatives judged potential spouses not only by personal qualities, but by the household needs that a marriage would meet. Household duties followed from these arrangements. A married couple managed the household as a unit. The husband often held formal duties in the domain, whether as an official, a manager of lands, or a military retainer. He dealt with records, tax accounts, and the lord's orders. The wife oversaw the domestic organization. This work included the management of servants, the care of food stores, the maintenance of clothing and armor, and the accounting of household resources. In larger households, these tasks were distributed among stewards and matrons, but final responsibility rested with the head of the family and the senior woman. In this way, the practical needs of a domain household required both administrative skill and attention to daily details. Lineage carried legal and emotional weight. Families kept registers of births, marriages, and deaths. These records determined inheritance and the transmission of stipends measured in rice. Over time, lineage became a central concern because the continuity of name and property validated a family's status. When a family faced the prospect of having no male heir, adoption offered a solution. Adoption of a son or of a son-in-law placed into the family preserved the lineage and the right to its holdings. These adoptions were legal acts with social repercussions. They sometimes created new bonds between households, and they could alter the balance of property and obligations across a region. Women in samurai families received instruction suited to their future responsibilities. Education for girls emphasized literacy, household management, and moral instruction. They learned to read and write, to keep accounts, and to perform ritual duties that upheld family observances. Calligraphy and the reading of classical texts were taught not only as marks of refinement, but as practical tools for communication and record keeping. Sewing, textile work, and the management of stores were part of a daily curriculum. Over time, this education prepared women to run households effectively when men were absent because of duty or travel. In some families, women also managed estates directly, supervising tenant farmers, organizing labor for repairs, and overseeing grain distribution. In this way, their training meshed practical administration with cultural expectations. Physical training for women varied by region and by family. In some households, girls learned the use of polearms and other defensive techniques. Such instruction aimed at protection of the home, especially when men were on campaign. Meanwhile, notions of appropriate conduct guided lessons in etiquette and public behavior. A woman's bearing in social contexts mattered because she represented her household in dealings with neighbors and allies. Over time, these practices created a form of resilience. Women who combined administrative skill with knowledge of defense were able to preserve household integrity under stress. Friendship among warriors existed alongside formal bonds of loyalty to a lord. A retainer's duty to his lord remained a defining obligation, and it structured political life. At the same time, personal ties between samurai developed through shared service, joint training, and mutual support. These relationships could be close. Men who had trained together, who had protected each other in the same garrison, or who had negotiated the same disputes often formed friendships that lasted decades. They exchanged letters, gifts, and occasional visits. In private conversation, they could speak frankly about family troubles, financial strain, or doubts about policy. Such confidences created a practical network of trust that supplemented formal hierarchies. Loyalty had many expressions. Formal pledges and oaths bound retainers to their lord, and these promises were enforceable by law and by custom. Meanwhile, informal practices reinforced trust. Hospitality, the sharing of food and drink, and the performance of favors created reciprocal obligations. When a retainer's family needed help, friends within the same rank often provided loans, supervised a substitute for duties, or coordinated childcare. In this way, loyalty was not only an abstract code, it was a system of mutual assistance that kept households functioning under the pressures of duty and economy. Conflict among samurai did occur, and it tested friendships. Rivalries over rank, competition for appointments, or disputes about honor could strain relations. In such cases, private negotiation, mediation by senior figures, and sometimes formal litigation resolved matters. Over time, social mechanisms emerged to diffuse tensions. Senior vassals and advisors acted as arbiters. They reminded younger men of the long-term consequences of public quarrels. In this way, the community of samurai contained internal checks that aimed to preserve order and to limit disruptive conflict. Family traditions often expressed a quiet dignity. Rituals marked stages of life. Coming-of-age ceremonies formalized the transition from childhood to adult responsibility. Mourning practices regulated behavior after death and ensured that obligations to ancestors were honored. Anniversaries of a parent's death were observed with visits to the family shrine, with the cleaning of the household altar, and with shared meals among relatives. Over time, these routines built a steady rhythm in family life. They affirmed continuity and provided occasions for younger members to learn the precedents they would one day uphold. The material culture of family life reinforced these traditions. Household heirlooms, such as swords, documents, and altar objects, were preserved with care. A sword could be both a weapon and an emblem of family history. Documents recorded land rights, stipends, and marriages. Altars and memorial tablets held lists of ancestors and guided rituals. In practical terms, these objects required maintenance. Metal needed cleaning, paper records needed safe storage, and shrines needed periodic repair. The responsibility for such tasks often fell to the senior woman, while men handled larger items and official documents. In this way, the division of labor served the goal of continuity. Intergenerational teaching linked practical skills with moral instruction. Parents expected children to learn the duties of household life through example and through direct teaching. Boys received training in estate management, archery, or swordsmanship, depending on their future roles. Daughters practiced household arts and ritual practice. Meanwhile, both sons and daughters received moral guidance that emphasized responsibility, respect for elders, and the duty to maintain the family's standing. Over time, this pattern reproduced social norms and ensured that techniques of governance and domestic management passed from one generation to the next. Economic realities shaped choices about marriage and family structure. Stipends measured in rice determined how many retainers a household could support. When stipends stagnated or expenses rose, families adapted. Some reduced household size. Others sought additional income through teaching, medicine, or artisan work. Marriages were sometimes arranged with an eye to the economic benefit they might bring. A daughter might marry into a household with a more secure income, or a son might assume the duties of a related branch to consolidate property. Adoption remained a common strategy to secure an heir and to prevent the loss of land through succession disputes. In this way, economic necessity interacted with cultural expectations to shape family decisions. The public face of honor influenced private life. Social standing depended on conduct that others recognized as dignified. Families observed rules of propriety at public events. They dressed according to rank at formal audiences. They performed rituals with care. Meanwhile, private disputes about honor were handled within networks of peers and advisors to avoid public scandal. Over time, the maintenance of reputation became a constant concern. It informed choices about marriage, about the management of assets, and about how households presented themselves to neighbors and to the Lord's administration. Women sometimes played direct roles in upholding family honor. They supervised the education of children and ensured that etiquette and language were taught. When disputes arose, senior women could act as negotiators with other households. Their knowledge of household records and of local customs made them effective intermediaries. In times of crisis, such as poor harvest or illness, they organized relief efforts within the extended family. These actions contributed to the household's resilience and to the preservation of its reputation. Friendship and loyalty also shaped ceremonial life. Festive gatherings, seasonal observances, and formal audiences provided occasions for samurai to meet and to renew bonds. In these settings, the exchange of gifts and the performance of shared rituals reinforced social ties. Meanwhile, quieter visits, such as tea and conversation at a neighbor's house, allowed for more candid exchanges. Over time, these varied forms of interaction created a layered social world in which public duty and private friendship coexisted. When the demands of the domain required travel or prolonged service, households adapted. Men who served away left instructions for their wives and elders. Power of attorney arrangements and written directives ensured that someone could act on the family's behalf. In this way, continuity of administration was possible even when the official head was absent. Meanwhile, children learned to accept the periodic absence of a parent as part of their social reality. This experience shaped expectations about duty and sacrifice. In the final account, family life for a samurai combined practical management with moral responsibility. Lineage and marriage connected households to broader political and economic systems. Education prepared women and men to manage those connections. Friendship and loyalty among warriors produced networks of mutual aid that supported families in times of need. Traditions and rituals provided a steady structure for passing duties between generations. Taken together, these elements formed a modest and disciplined way of life. It was a life organized around continuity, responsibility, and the careful performance of daily obligations. Religion, art, and philosophy formed connected paths in the lives of many people in feudal Japan. They did not appear as separate domains. Instead, they overlapped in practice and in purpose. Belief and training, ritual and aesthetic work, ethical thought, and technical skill informed one another. Over time, these elements shaped habits of mind that valued clarity, restraint, and careful attention to action. In this narration, I will describe how Zen teachings influenced calmness and clarity, how arts such as poetry, calligraphy, and the tea ceremony became spiritual practices, how the pursuit of beauty took shape through disciplined work, and how temples and ritual life supported the stillness of thought. Zen appeared in Japan through contact with Chinese Buddhist traditions. A key figure in this process was Eisai, a monk who traveled to China and returned in the late 12th century with new teachings. He introduced forms associated with the Rinzai school and emphasized seated meditation and direct instruction. A few decades later, Dogen developed and adapted the Soto school. He placed particular emphasis on shikantaza, or just sitting, and on continuous practice as expression of awakening. These developments took root during periods of social change, including the rise of military governments in the 12th and 13th centuries. Warriors and court officials encountered Zen ideas in their own contexts. The teachings offered a method for refining attention, and therefore they suited roles that required calm judgment under pressure. Zen instruction focused on disciplined practice more than on elaborate doctrine. Monks sat in zazen, they followed strict schedules, and they learned under senior teachers who monitored both posture and mind. Meanwhile, koan practice in certain lineages presented short, paradoxical questions intended to prompt insight through focused inquiry. In the Soto tradition, emphasis fell on sustained sitting and on carrying that concentrated attention into ordinary tasks. Over time, these methods trained practitioners to keep the mind steady, to notice distractions, and to return to the present task with minimal waste of energy. In daily life, the result could be a capacity for measured response. Warriors valued this steadiness when they faced decisions in camp or on the field. Administrators found it useful in managing disputes. Artisans discovered it useful when their work demanded precision. The influence of Zen extended into artistic practice in a direct way. Several arts developed associations with contemplative aims. Poetry, calligraphy, and the tea ceremony became forms of disciplined expression that were also understood as spiritual practice. Poetry had a long history in Japan, drawn from earlier court traditions such as waka, and linked to collaborative forms like renga. In the medieval and early modern periods, poets at various ranks addressed themes of impermanence, duty, and observation. Meanwhile, Zen monks and samurai wrote poems that reflected the practice of concentrated attention. The act of composing a short verse required compression of thought and economy of language. For some practitioners, poetry served as a way to clarify feeling and to present an image of thought that others could read and consider. Calligraphy or shodo offered another field for training of attention. The practice centered on the use of brush, ink, and paper. Mastery required control of wrist, arm, and breath. Each stroke demanded a decision about speed and pressure. Teachers corrected posture and guided the student's breath to ensure that movements were not hurried or slack. Over time, the discipline of regular practice produced clearer characters and steadier hands. In this way, calligraphy functioned both as an aesthetic pursuit and as a method for cultivating composure. Documents, sutra copies, and personal letters carried the marks of this training. Officials judged a writer's discipline by the care of their script, and artists considered calligraphy of equal importance to painting or poetry. The tea ceremony, chanoyu, became perhaps the most widely recognized art tied to Zen sensibility. Its development gathered momentum in the 16th century, when political consolidation created opportunities for new forms of social interaction. A central figure in this history was Sen no Rikyu, who articulated a rigorous set of practices and an aesthetic orientation for the tea room. He emphasized simplicity, attentiveness to detail, and the correct sequence of gestures. In a tea gathering, the host prepared equipment carefully, cleaned utensils, and arranged items in prescribed ways. Guests observed formal entry and seating, received the bowl, and drank according to taught etiquette. In this way, the tea ceremony turned routine actions into a sequence that required focus and discipline. It trained both hosts and guests in listening, in observing subtle social cues, and in performing tasks with steady hands. These arts shared a common aim. They encouraged practitioners to work with a sharp, uncluttered mind. Meanwhile, the work itself required repetition and refinement. A poet rewrote lines, a calligrapher practiced the same character many times, and a tea host perfected the folding of a cloth and the motion of a ladle. In this way, the pursuit of beauty became an exercise in control and refinement. Beauty did not arise solely from sudden inspiration. It emerged from patient application and from standards set by teachers and peers. Craftsmen in lacquer, metalwork, and textile production followed similar patterns. Treatments of surface, the joining of materials, and the exactness of proportion depended on measured, repeatable technique. Over time, the continuity of practice ensured that standards passed from one generation to the next. Art and ritual intersected in material culture as well. Temples, for example, were centers for both religious learning and artistic production. Their buildings required carpentry of a precise kind, with joinery that did not rely on nails, and with proportions that responded to both structural needs and formal standards. Meanwhile, the production of painted screens, hanging scrolls, and ceremonial objects often involved collaboration between monks, patrons, and specialized artisans. Temples housed libraries of sutras and collections of calligraphic works. They commissioned gardens and arranged spaces for meditation. In this way, the physical environment supported a mode of practice that combined aesthetic care with spiritual intent. Ritual practice in temples followed a clear timetable. Morning services often began before dawn. Monks moved through set chants, recitations, and periods of seated meditation. Meals were taken with attention to rule and to portion. Manual work, called samu, also formed part of the day. Practitioners repaired buildings, tended grounds, and prepared offerings. In this work, the same principles of attention and exactness applied. Over time, the repetition of such tasks reinforced trained patterns of mind. Rituals outside the monastic setting also integrated art and discipline. Seasonal ceremonies, memorial services, and household altars used prescribed words and gestures. Memorial tablets and family records were kept with care. In these contexts, the form of action mattered. Correct performance signaled respect and maintained social order. Philosophical reflection underpinned these practices. Zen emphasized direct experience rather than scholastic debate. Yet other currents of thought, including Neo-Confucian ethics and Pure Land devotion, coexisted with Zen in Japanese society. Neo-Confucian ideas provided frameworks for social duties and for governance. They offered models for loyalty, filial duty, and correct relations among ranks. Pure Land practicers focused on faith and on the recitation of a Buddha's name as a method of salvation. These strands met in everyday life. A samurai might sit with a Zen teacher in the morning, consult Confucian maxims for conduct in the afternoon, and offer prayers at a household altar in the evening. In this way, intellectual and spiritual modes did not exclude one another. Rather, they formed a repertoire of responses suited to different needs. The pursuit of clarity affected ethical conduct. Clear thinking allowed for measured decisions, and disciplined attention reduced errors in judgment. Warriors practiced swordsmanship and horseback skills under strict instruction. Zen training complemented these physical disciplines by stabilizing thought. Meanwhile, administrators relied on careful record keeping and on clear writing. Calligraphic training, as noted earlier, reinforced habits of precision that mattered for legal and fiscal documents. In households, religious practice and artistic discipline shaped patterns of behavior. Parents instructed children in ritual observance, in etiquette, and in the memory of ancestors. Over time, these lessons formed expectations about conduct and about the role of beauty in daily life. Social functions also relied on shared artistic practice. Tea gatherings served political ends as well as aesthetic ones. Lords and their retainers met in formal settings to discuss alliances, to negotiate agreements, and to demonstrate status. Presentation mattered. The arrangement of objects, the selection of a scroll, and the care of the tea utensils signaled control and taste. Meanwhile, poetry gatherings and calligraphic exchanges formed networks of cultural capital. Participation marked membership in certain circles. A well-executed poem or a refined brushwork could advance reputation. In this way, artistic training served social aims in addition to spiritual ones. Temples provided spaces for learning across social boundaries. Some monasteries admitted lay students and offered instruction to members of the warrior class. Scholars traveled among centers of learning, and patrons supported the copying of texts. Over time, these contacts spread ideas and techniques. Artisans learned new methods from temple workshops. Officials borrowed forms of ritual order for secular ceremonies. The result was a diffusion of disciplined practice into many parts of society. Even commoners encountered elements of these traditions in seasonal festivals and in local shrines that incorporated borrowed forms of ritual. The stillness of thought cultivated in temple life and in artistic work had practical consequences. Calmness under pressure reduced the likelihood of impulsive action. Clarity of mind improved the capacity to assess risks and to consider consequences. Over time, institutions that encouraged disciplined attention found that practitioners developed steadier habits in both private and public life. The practice of returning again and again to a simple task, whether composing a verse, copying a sutra, or polishing a tea bowl, trained the mind to resist distraction. In daily affairs, this training translated into a greater capacity for focused work, for deliberate speech, and for careful decision-making. The relationship between beauty and discipline also had limits and tensions. The pursuit of aesthetic standards could become a form of conformity. Standards set by elite circles sometimes excluded alternate methods and local traditions. Meanwhile, the demands of patronage shaped artistic production, and artists adapted their work to meet the expectations of sponsors. Rituals that remained fixed could lose immediate meaning for some practitioners. At the same time, innovation occurred within the framework of discipline. New schools of tea, new poetic forms, and new approaches to painting emerged when practitioners experimented within established limits. In this way, the system balanced preservation with change. Finally, the combined effect of religion, art, and philosophy produced a particular pattern of daily life. Men and women moved through routines that combined physical tasks, ritual observance, and aesthetic care. They learned to value attention to detail, to follow prescribed forms, and to bring steady effort to each task. Temples offered formal instruction, and secular settings provided occasions for practice and display. Over years of repetition, these habits shaped a way of being that prized calmness and clarity. It did not promise easy answers. Rather, it offered methods for refining action and for shaping thought by disciplined, regular work. Taken together, these practices created a durable culture of careful attention. Zen meditation taught practitioners to sit with the mind and to return to the present. Calligraphy and poetry trained the hand and the voice to express clear thought. The tea ceremony organized simple gestures into a program of exactness. Temples and rituals provided settings in which stillness of thought could be sustained. Over time, these strands reinforced one another and informed both private life and public conduct. The result was a set of habits and institutions that valued clarity, control, and the steady cultivation of skill. death was a constant element in the life of a samurai. Warriors lived in a world where combat, illness, and political change could bring sudden endings. For many samurai, the ideal was to face death without fear. This attitude did not arise from callousness. Rather, it grew from training, social expectation, and a set of practices that taught a measured response to danger. Over time, the capacity to meet death calmly became one of the qualities by which a warrior was judged. The idea of death without fear had several sources. Zen instruction encouraged practitioners to observe the mind and to hold attention steady. In daily practice, this training reduced anxious distraction. Meanwhile, Confucian ethics emphasized duty and loyalty. A samurai learned to subordinate personal desire to obligations toward lord and family. These strands joined with longer military traditions in which personal courage and composure mattered for survival. In this cultural setting, the prospect of death was framed less as a private catastrophe and more as an event that could be met with responsibility and dignity. Ritual suicide occupied a distinct and formal place among the possible responses to dishonor, defeat, or political failure. The term seppuku describes a specific rite in which a samurai ended his own life by cutting his abdomen. The phrase harakiri is a colloquial word that refers to the same act. Seppuku could be voluntary or it could be ordered as a punishment. In either case, it was understood as an assertion of agency and as an act that affected the social standing of a family. A samurai who performed seppuku might preserve honor that would otherwise have been lost through capture, execution, or disgrace. The meaning of seppuku was shaped by its ritual framework. In the most formal instances, the act was carried out according to established procedures. The setting might be a private room, a garden, or a public hall. The samurai wore a white kimono, a color associated with purity and with death, and placed a short sword or dagger before him. He composed a final statement or a short poem called a jisai or death poem, which expressed his state of mind in simple terms. Friends, family, retainers, and magistrates often attended. Their presence confirmed the act's public character and recorded its completion for legal and social purposes. A crucial role in the ritual was that of the second, called the kaishikunin. This person stood near the samurai and performed a single, swift cut to end suffering after the initial wound. The aim was to spare a protracted death and to ensure that the act retained dignity. The kaishikunin's cut required skill and calm. In many accounts, the motion left a small strip of flesh, an outcome that signaled care both for the wounded samurai and for the proprieties of the ritual. In some cases, the second was a superior or a trusted friend. In others, the role was assigned by authorities. The presence of a second transformed seppuku from a solely private act into a structured procedure. Witnesses fulfilled several functions. They verified the samurai's intent and the event's completion. They recorded the circumstances for officials. They also marked rank and affiliation. A public seppuku might be performed before a magistrate to signal that justice had been served. A private seppuku in a family home could allow relatives to tend to the body quickly and to make the necessary arrangements for burial and for the transfer of household responsibilities. In this way, witnesses helped to integrate the act into social and legal systems. The ritual contained overt spiritual symbolism. The abdomen was seen as the seat of the self in certain readings, and the act of cutting it carried meanings of purification and of internal offering. The white garments and the composing of a jisai suggested readiness for the transition to the next world. Recitation of short prayers or the placement of simple offerings sometimes accompanied the act. Zen practice informed the mental preparation, instructing samurai to keep attention focused and to meet pain without confusion. At the same time, Confucian ideas encouraged the notion that a carefully executed death could restore balance in the social order. As a result, seppuku became part of a moral vocabulary that addressed shame, blame, and responsibility. Rituals varied across time and place. In earlier centuries, the act could take place on the battlefield, while later periods codified procedures more strictly. During the Tokugawa period, when the military class was organized under the shogunate, seppuku acquired formal legal meanings. Daimyos and retainers who brought dishonor upon themselves were sometimes permitted to die by seppuku rather than by public execution. The permission conferred a measure of respect and protected the family from additional penalties. Officials recorded the event and mediated the consequences for inheritance and reputation. These arrangements made seppuku a regulated practice rather than a purely spontaneous gesture. There were different contexts for seppuku. In some cases, it functioned as atonement. A commander who failed in duty might choose to die to accept responsibility for the consequences of a campaign. In other instances, seppuku served as a protest. A samurai might refuse to live under a lord whose actions he could not accept, and thus signal an uncompromising stance. Seppuku could also be a punishment. When a samurai attacked an official, broke a law, or embarrassed his lord, authorities sometimes offered seppuku as a way to resolve the matter with formal dignity. The distinctions mattered. Voluntary seppuku carried a very different social message from seppuku performed under orders. Female ritual suicide existed as well, and it followed different forms. Women of samurai families sometimes chose a practice known as jigai. Rather than cutting the abdomen, a woman might sever the throat with a small blade. The social logic behind jigai included the desire to avoid capture and possible dishonor in ways that reflected the gendered expectations of the time. Practices for women were linked to household responsibility and to the protection of family honor. In all cases, the community judged outcomes by standards that combined social expectation and moral reasoning. Specific historical examples illustrate how seppuku became embedded in Japanese memory. One well-known case occurred in 1701 CE. Asano Naganori, a lord in Edo, attacked a court official inside the castle. For this breach of etiquette, the shogunate ordered his death. Asano was required to commit seppuku. His retainers lost their positions and their homes. In time, 47 of them avenged his death by killing the official they held responsible. These men then surrendered and were ordered to commit seppuku themselves. The episode became famous and entered literature and theater as a story about loyalty, duty, and consequence. It showed how seppuku functioned both as punishment and as a catalyst for further action. Another prominent instance took place in 1582 CE. Oda Nobunaga, a leading military figure of his time, met death during an attack at a temple. Betrayed by a general under his command, He faced imminent capture and was recorded as taking his own life in the face of defeat. The account of his end shaped later depictions of decisive action in crisis. It also demonstrated the connection between military collapse and the choice to die in order to avoid a fate deemed worse than death. In the later 19th century, shifts in political power created new instances of ritual suicide. Seigo Takamori, a leader in the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877 CE, fell in battle and ended his life in the aftermath of defeat. His death was recounted as an example of loyalty to a cause, even as the political order changed. Then, in 1912, CE General Nogi Mersuk and his wife performed seppuku after the death of the sovereign whom he had served. Their action reflected a particular interpretation of obligation in the transition from the old military-centered order to the modern state. Public reaction was complex. Some admired the gesture as a final expression of duty. Others saw it as a remnant of an older code that did not fit the present. These and other examples show how seppuku shaped the story of the samurai. The practice provided material for plays, for historical writing, and for moral instruction. In theater and in popular narratives, episodes of ritual suicide were staged to emphasize loyalty, courage, or the tragic consequences of political conflict. Over time, such representations contributed to a legend of samurai as figures who placed honor above life. The legend was selective. It highlighted certain acts while eliding the messy politics and the human contradictions that lay behind them. Nevertheless, these stories influenced how later generations understood the warrior class. Seppuku also affected social institutions. Families altered strategies for marriage and succession when a household head lost status through an ordered death. Official registers recorded the circumstances of seppuku, and magistrates used those records to decide questions of property and rank. Military leaders adjusted tactics when the possibility of ritual suicide shaped a subordinate's choices in battle. In this way, the practice was not merely symbolic. It exerted practical consequences in legal and military affairs. The ethical debate around seppuku evolved as Japan changed. Intellectuals and officials discussed whether ritual suicide belonged to a civilized legal system or whether it represented a concession to archaic custom. During the Meiji period, authorities moved to abolish special privileges attached to samurai status. They criminalized some forms of ritual self-harm and sought to build a national law that treated all citizens more uniformly. Despite these reforms, memories of seppuku persisted. The image of the samurai who calmly met death continued to carry influence in moral discussions and in the public imagination. When we consider the practice calmly, it becomes clear that seppuku combined personal resolve with public regulation. The act addressed questions of guilt, responsibility, and social order. It allowed individuals to assume control over an otherwise degrading end. Meanwhile, witnesses and officials integrated the event into a larger system of meaning. The ritual itself required preparation, skill, and a shared vocabulary of symbols. Today, historians look at seppuku with attention to both context and consequence. They study the records that show when the practice was permitted and when it was suppressed. They note that many instances were shaped by politics rather than by pure notions of honor. They also examine how stories of ritual suicide were used to instruct, to inspire, or to justify particular forms of conduct. In this way, the history of seppuku reveals the interplay between individual choice and collective authority. In the quiet of reflection, one can see that seppuku was not simply an act of personal despair. It was embedded in a culture of duty, of ritual, and of law. Warriors who chose that path did so within systems that defined what honor required and what social consequences would follow. Over centuries, the act became a point of contact between inner resolve and public order. The samurai legend that grew from it combined training, moral expectation, and historical circumstance. It shaped images of courage and obligation that remained visible long after the institutional basis of the samurai had changed. In this way, the memory of seppuku continued to inform questions about responsibility, death, and the terms by which a person might meet the end of life. The story of the samurai in modern Japan begins with a clear turning point. In 1868 CE, a political transformation known as the Meiji Restoration returned formal authority to the imperial court and ended the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. Military defeats, economic strain, and internal divisions had weakened the old order. In this new phase, the leaders who came to power sought to build a different kind of state, one that could stand equal to Western powers. To do that, they needed centralized authority, a modern economy, and a new military. These aims, pursued with urgency, affected the social group we call the samurai more deeply than any single law. The new government acted through a series of measures that removed the legal and economic foundations of the samurai class. In 1771 CE, the central authorities abolished the feudal domains and replaced them with prefectures. In this way, daimyo lost territorial autonomy and were compelled to move into the capital, where they became part of a unified administration. Then came reforms to military service. A national conscription law introduced in 1873 CE created a modern army drawn from the entire population, rather than from a hereditary warrior elite. Meanwhile, stipends that had supported many samurai were commuted into government bonds or otherwise reduced. Finally, the Heitorei Edict of 1876 CE prohibited the public wearing of swords by most people. That law, though brief in its description, had a powerful symbolic effect. The sword had been a visible sign of rank and authority. When public sword-wearing ended, a clear marker of samurai status disappeared. The legal and fiscal measures did not remove the samurai in a single stroke. Some retainers and lords adjusted sooner than others. Some accepted new positions in the central government or in the new prefectural administrations. Others resisted. A series of uprisings followed. The most famous of these was the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877 CE. Former samurai of the Satsuma and other domains marched under the leadership of Seigo Takamori. The rebellion grew out of frustration with lost stipends, with what many saw as the erosion of traditional honor, and with political marginalization. The government ultimately suppressed the revolt with modern conscripted troops and artillery. Seigo was killed in battle, and his death signaled, for many, the definitive end of large-scale samurai resistance. Yet the motives of those who rose were varied. Some fought for regional autonomy, others for personal dignity. The outcome made clear that the central state could and would enforce its reforms. As the legal privileges of the samurai declined, individuals and families sought new ways to survive and to contribute. Many men who had been samurai entered the institutions of the modern state. They found work in the army and navy as officers, where experience with discipline and command proved useful. Others entered the police, which borrowed organizational models from samurai households. Bureaucracy offered another path. The new ministries required administrators and clerks, and samurai with literacy and training were a natural pool of recruits. In this way, the state absorbed part of the old leadership class into its machinery. Business and industry also drew former samurai. Some who once served lords became entrepreneurs, managers, or founders of companies. Iwasaki Yataro, for example, came from a samurai family in Tosa and later established a shipping company that became part of a larger industrial group. Shibusawa Ichi, another figure from samurai origins, promoted commerce and founded enterprises that aimed to modernize Japan's economy. In factories and trading firms, the discipline and networks of former retainers could be repurposed. Over time, they learned new technical skills and commercial practices. Educational institutions helped this transition. Schools that taught Western science, law, and engineering offered samurai a route to new professions. In many cases, these men combined traditional forms of moral instruction with modern technical knowledge. Not all samurai adapted in the same way. Some entered politics and helped to shape the new constitutional order. Figures such as Ito Hirobumi moved from regional leadership into national leadership, helping to draft institutional frameworks and constitutions. Others pursued intellectual life. Fukuzawa Yukichi, born into a lower samurai family, became a leading educator and public intellectual. He questioned inherited privileges and argued for a society based on merit and modern learning. In the arts and letters, former samurai found outlets as well. They wrote histories, translated texts, and taught in schools. Through teaching and publication, they influenced the values of later generations. The idea of a samurai spirit moved into new contexts. In the Meiji era and after, writers and officials began to use the term Bushido, literally the way of the warrior, as a way of naming a set of virtues: loyalty, courage, frugality, honor, and self-discipline. Scholars debated what Bushido had been in earlier centuries and what it might mean now. Nidobe Inaz published an account of Bushido near the turn of the 20th century that aimed to explain the concept to readers abroad. In his work and in other writings, the samurai code was often reframed as a source of moral strength for a modern nation. The state sometimes encouraged this redefinition. School curricula, official ceremonies, and public rhetoric drew selectively on samurai ideals to foster loyalty to the emperor and to the nation. In this way, elements of the samurai ethic were mobilized for civic purposes. Over time, the influence of samurai values reached several areas of social life. In the military, these virtues contributed to the ethos of officers and to institutional discipline. Civil servants and business leaders adopted practices that emphasized duty and hierarchy. In family life and education, certain codes of behavior, emphasis on respect for elders, on perseverance, and on attentiveness to social duty, found new expression. Meanwhile, the arts preserved samurai narratives and made them available to a wider public. Theater, fiction, and later, film reimagined episodes from the samurai past. These representations shaped common understandings of courage and responsibility. The legacy of the samurai expanded beyond Japan. As Japan engaged with the world, images of the samurai traveled with goods, with students, and with diplomats. In the West, translators and commentators took an interest in Bushido and in samurai stories. Nitob's book, translated into English, reached audiences overseas and influenced perceptions of Japan's cultural distinctiveness. Later film and literature strengthened that image. Directors such as Akira Kurosawa brought samurai stories to global attention in the middle of the 20th century. His films, translated and shown internationally, presented samurai characters in narratives that addressed duty, leadership, and social order. In this way, the figure of the samurai entered a global cultural vocabulary. At the same time, popular culture simplified aspects of the past. Swords, armor, and the image of single combat became common motifs in novels, films, and, eventually, video games. Museums and collectors placed samurai artifacts into exhibitions that drew international visitors. Martial arts derived from samurai training, such as kendo and iaido, spread around the world. These practices preserved techniques and rituals of movement, and they served as living links to a martial tradition. Over time, they became part of a global interest in discipline and skill, practiced by people with no direct connection to the historical samurai class. Historians today examine these developments with attention to nuance. They note that the samurai were not a single, unchanging type. Regional differences, economic variety, and shifting political alignments shaped samurai lives before the Meiji period. Over the 19th century, many adapted quickly to new roles. Others resisted or suffered loss. Scholars also point out that the selective use of samurai ideals by the Meiji state and by later institutions sometimes smoothed over contradictions. Duty and loyalty could serve both civic aims and political control. In some contexts, the appeal to samurai values justified strict hierarchies. In others, it inspired personal commitment to public service. Careful study seeks to understand these multiple outcomes. Memory is part of the legacy as well. In towns and cities across Japan, monuments, preserved houses, and local records keep the stories of samurai families alive. Annual ceremonies and cultural festivals recall episodes from local history. Schools and museums present narratives that emphasize service, courage, or craft. Some communities honor particular figures for their actions in the transition to modernity. In this way, the past remains a living reference point in civic life. When we look at the long arc, a pattern emerges. The legal end of the samurai class was decisive in institutional terms. Reforms in the late 19th century removed hereditary privileges and created a modern state. Yet the people who had been samurai often found ways to carry skills and values into new institutions. They staffed ministries, founded companies, taught in schools, and served in the armed forces. Over time, a widely circulating image of the samurai, one that emphasized discipline, loyalty, and skill, entered national education and international culture. That image has been adapted many times. It has been praised, criticized, and reshaped. In this way, the samurai left a legacy that is neither wholly past nor wholly present. It exists in laws that no longer privilege a warrior class, in institutions that grew from samurai participation, and in stories and practices that continue to shape how people think about duty and conduct. The decline of the samurai as a legal class was a clear historical fact. The broader influence of their practices and ideas, meanwhile, unfolded over decades and across many social fields. In quiet reflection, the story is one of change and continuity. Men and women who lived through the transition made choices under pressure. Their actions influenced institutions and cultural forms. Today, the samurai remain a subject of study, a theme in art, and a set of practices in martial traditions. Their memory continues to invite questions about how a society redefines honor, service, and public responsibility in the face of rapid change. We have walked through a long story about change, duty, and daily life. Over time, institutions shifted and legal status ended, and yet practices and values continued in new places. Some people moved into government, others into business or education. In this way, skills and habits were carried forward. Remember that history is made of many small choices. Men and women adjusted in different ways. Some resisted, some adapted quickly, some found new roles. Meanwhile, ideas about honor and service were reshaped and then used for different purposes. That complexity is part of the record. It reminds us that social change is gradual and uneven. Now it is time to rest from this account. Allow the facts and the steady details to settle. Think of the practical lessons the story offers about adaptation, about the reform of institutions, about the movement from one order to another. Let these observations be simple companion thoughts, not burdens. Adapt calmly to the subject you have heard. Take what is useful and leave what is not. Over the next moments, breathe slowly and let attention move away from analysis and toward quiet. In this way, the mind can hold what it needs and release what it does not. Good rest. May the calm facts of the past support plain understanding and peaceful sleep.